Hello, everyone, and welcome to Lesson 7, the Executive Branch, the Presidency, Vice Presidency, the Cabinet, and the Bureaucracy. The Executive Branch is created by the United States Constitution in Article 2. The Executive Branch officers, elected by the American people, are the President of the United States and the Vice President of the United States. For both positions, the requirements are that you be a U.S.-born citizen, that you are at least 35 years old, and that you have lived 14 years continuously in the United States prior to you being elected and holding office. Now, there are some people who would argue that the vice president does not specifically have to be 35 or a U.S. born citizen, but the Constitution is clear that the vice president has to be eligible to serve as president. So the requirements of the President of the United States are also the requirements of the Vice President of the United States. The President of the United States of America. Well, this is a new position that was created by the Founding Fathers when they realized that there needed to be one unified authority to steer the ship of state. The idea that there was a legislative administrator that acted as the head of state just didn't seem like it was working under the Articles of Confederation. Now, some founders wanted this to be a powerful position. Others wanted it to be a ceremonial position. And the position that's actually created here in 1787 is a much more powerful position than the founders had ever envisioned. And the reason for this is because it was created solely for one person, and that was George Washington. They wanted this to be powerful enough that Washington would accept. And many scholars, and I'll admit, including myself, believe that this position would have never existed in its current form if it was not given to George Washington first. It most likely would have been a lot weaker in its authority. Now, what are the powers of the President of the United States? Well, first of all, his number one power as the chief executive is to execute the law. His job is to uphold laws passed by Congress. That's his first major power. The second thing is that he is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. Now, the president cannot declare war. Only Congress can do that. But once war is declared, the president of the United States is the commander-in-chief of our military forces. He is also the supervisor of foreign policy, and he usually delegates this to the Department of State and his appointed Secretary of State, who is the chief foreign officer of the United States. But he is the supervisor. He hires and fires the Secretary of State. He chooses the under-secretaries of state in their different positions. So the President of the United States is really, even though we usually call the Secretary of State the chief diplomat, the President is really the one that's leading the foreign policy. The President of the United States also appoints the federal judiciary and an advisory cabinet. At the end of the previous president's term, the entire cabinet resigns, and the new president then chooses his cabinet to advise him. Now, the federal judiciary does not resign at the end of a presidential administration. Those positions are for life. And so at the end of an old administration, any empty positions would then be given to the next president to fill. And depending on how many seats he has in the Senate is the one that has to approve both. The President of the United States also holds veto power over legislation. The initial intent is if the president felt that this violated the Constitution, that he would veto it. Now, more modern presidents veto legislation they don't agree with. The President of the United States is also required to submit a report to Congress on a periodic basis. This report is what we call the State of the Union Address. And Congress has declared that the president must give a yearly State of the Union update. Now, it's not the speech. The speech is purely political. The letter that the president sends that comes along with the speech is actually the State of the Union that is put into the record. The speech is just for us. It's for our entertainment value and for educational value as well, to tell us what the president is doing and what he is planning to do in the next year of his term. Now, those are the outright powers, the outlined powers within the Constitution. But there are other powers that the president can use. Now, what are the other ways that a president can gain or use powers? Well, the first one is what we call inherent powers, and this is where the president claims some kind of authority, and he does so because there's some kind of ambiguity within the Constitution. The Constitution simply implies something that the president might be able to do. Typically, these powers are, not clear-cut. So there could be court battles to decide whether the president has this power. And I'll give you 3 examples. The first is Abraham Lincoln. During the American Civil War, he did a lot of things that you could argue were not within the realm of the American Constitution. And Lincoln said, quite correctly, really, what good is upholding the Constitution if you can't keep the Union that recognizes that Constitution together? Franklin D. Roosevelt, during the Great Depression and World War II, he had 2 major disasters happen. He came into the Great Depression, and then World War II happened on his watch. And the question is, does the Constitution give him the power to resolve the Great Depression through the New Deal, or to do some of the things that we had to do during World War II that maybe were a little more unpleasant, like the Japanese internment camps? Well, Roosevelt would argue that in order to protect democracy and to protect the Constitution itself, he had to use some of the gray area of that Constitution to preserve, protect, and defend the American people. George W. Bush gets a lot of criticism for this as well. During September 11th and the War on Terror, George W. Bush took some extraordinary steps that were, by most people's accounts, looked unconstitutional. And the Bush administration's arguments in court were, no, actually, the spirit of them may be unconstitutional, but there is some inference within the Constitution that the chief executive can do these things. So that's the first way that a president can gain or use certain powers that are not specifically outlined within the Constitution. The other is what we call delegation of powers, and this is where Congress passes a law. And in this law, they say, and Congress and or the executive has the right to uphold this law through certain steps. And then Congress will outline steps that it will allow the executive branch to do. Now, this is, by the way, this is borderline unconstitutional, because the argument is that the branches of government cannot give each other power. That is why when we look at Marbury versus Madison, when we talk about the judicial branch, why that case was so important, because Congress was trying to give the Supreme Court a power, and only the Constitution can give a branch of government power. Well, this is, if you talk to Congress, Congress will say, well, we're not giving the executive power. We're just delegating some of our power to uphold the law to the president and asking him to do it for us. And so that's the reasoning. For example, Franklin D. Roosevelt during the Great Depression, Congress gave him a lot of latitude in dealing with the Depression. They gave him a lot of wiggle room to try different things with the New Deal in order to try to solve the Depression and heal America's economy. Same thing with Richard Nixon in the 1970s. Congress did a lot when it came to the federal workforce and freezing their pay raises and things like that. And they delegated the actual implementation of that to the Nixon administration and let them do it. So These are two ways that the president has gained or used powers that are not specifically within the Constitution. But remember that these things are inferred or inherent, and that in the case of the delegation of powers, that can be taken back from Congress at any time. Inherent powers, that is something that is a little bit trickier to use or not use. Now, the Vice President of the United States is elected concurrently with the President of the United States, and he is the second officer of the United States. Now, this is also a new position that was created under the Constitution, Article 2, and there are no real clear-cut powers or authority for the Vice President in the executive branch. As we talked about last week, he does have powers and authority within the legislative branch because he is the President of the Senate. But here in the executive branch, he is essentially a backup president. He is only here in the death or in the event of a death or resignation of the office holder. In the case most recently of President John F. Kennedy, Kennedy was assassinated in office. His vice president, Lyndon B. Johnson, became president of the United States. That was really the only purpose of the president. As I said before, obviously in the Senate, he does have powers, including casting a tie-breaking vote. But the vice president also can be assigned duties by the president if necessary. Now, for the first 150 years of the American vice presidency, the traditional role of the vice presidency was the chief campaigner, the chief fundraiser, and essentially the administration's representative at home and abroad. Mainly from about 1945 on, abroad. The president would send the vice president to different countries when they were having significant ceremonies, weddings of royalty, and he would be the administration's representative. But beginning in the 1970s, you began to see a more modern role for the vice president. Walter Mondale, who was chosen by James Jimmy Carter to be the vice president, had a very strong career in the U.S. Senate. And so when Carter was elected, he used Mondale as his representative to the Senate because he had never actually had any kind of national elected office. He had been the governor of Georgia. When you look at someone like George H.W. Bush, George H.W. Bush was chosen by Ronald Reagan because, one, he was a younger man than Reagan. Reagan at the time was the oldest elected president. But second, he was seen as a more typical Republican politician, and he helped with the Republican base. And he also balanced out the fact that Reagan was a California Republican, and that didn't always translate well to the middle of the country. So that was an area. Another example where it's very important, Al Gore was chosen by Bill Clinton. Two Southerners. That's not usually something you see on a ticket, but Bill Clinton made the argument that he had the executive experience from being the governor of Arkansas for a long period of time, since the late 70s, early 80s, and that Gore was coming in to be his chief legislative ambassador, because Al Gore had been a senator before he became vice president. George W. Bush, who was elected in 2000 and took office in 2001, chose his father's Secretary of Defense, Richard Dick Cheney. The reason why he chose him is Bush was young. Bush had some credibility issues. He had only been governor of Texas for about 5 years, 5.5 years at the time he won the election. And so there were some questions as to whether or not Bush was competent and capable of being president. So Cheney became one of the most powerful vice presidents in history. He had a very large portfolio, especially when it came to national defense. Joe Biden, from my home state of Delaware, who is the current nominee, the nominee for the Democrats for the 2020 presidential election. Joe Biden, if you look at him, he was brought on to balance out Barack Obama. Barack Obama was a relatively new figure. He was an African American, which was for many Americans a little disconcerting because there is still some hesitation there. You heard it a lot. There were polls done before the election where people would say, "I'm just not sure I'm ready to have a black president." But the older white man who stood by his side, who had a long, distinguished political career. I believe he had 36 years, or it had been, I think it was about, yeah, I think it was 30 years, and he was starting his next Senate term, which would have been 36. But he had been in office for approximately 30 years and had this long legislative record to show that he would work with Congress to help the Obama administration. If you look at how Trump has handled his vice president, he chose Mike Pence of Indiana. Mike Pence had been a congressman, he had been a governor, and he is, this may offend some people, but he is the legitimate politician of the Trump administration. Trump is basically a bulldozer. He never held political office before. You're never really sure what his political ideology is. One day he's pro-life, then he's pro-choice. Whereas Mike Pence is a solid Christian conservative Republican. He even says that he is a Christian and a conservative and a Republican in that order. So he brings some legitimacy to the Trump administration. Now, in the modern era, since Mondale in '76, we have had one that had a negative influence, and that was George H.W. Bush. George H.W. Bush decided he was going to nominate for vice president a younger man who had had a fairly good political career, but he was in his early 40s, and he was just seen as childlike and not ready for prime time, and that was, of course, Dan Quayle. And some of that was unfair. Yes, Dan Quayle did fudge spelling the word potato. Yes, Dan Quayle started a fight with a mythical or a fictional TV character, Murphy Brown, but he did have real legislative chops. But he actually was a negative for the Bush administration and for the '92 Bush re-election campaign. So, the modern role is a governing partner, but you also have to make sure that they still fit that traditional role. And mainly more than that, you have to ask the question, are they capable of being president on day one? Example of this is in 2008. Barack Obama chose Joe Biden, a late 60s, early 70s-year-old man who had had a long career in government. Whereas John McCain, who had had a long career in government, chose Sarah Palin, who had been a mayor of a very small Alaskan town and then had been governor of Alaska for about a year and a half. Being governor of Alaska, no offense to Alaska, it is basically like being the mayor of a medium-sized Texas town, population-wise. So people had to ask that question when they went into the polling booth. Is this person, in this case, woman, Sarah Palin, ready to be president on day one? And a lot of voters who may have voted for John McCain and Joe Lieberman or John McCain and Lindsey Graham went into the voting booth that day and said, no, she's not qualified. McCain at that time was going to be the oldest elected president in history. And so they decided to choose the person who had the better backup. So all these things come into play when presidents or presidential nominees choose their vice presidential running mate. And this goes true to right now. Kamala Harris, the senator from California, she is the vice presidential nominee. And if you look at her, she was chosen because she's younger than Joe Biden. She's a woman, and that is very desirable, by the way, for both parties. Both parties are looking to try to get a foothold with the female base. And if you look at it, more women voted for Hillary Clinton in 2016, but more white women voted for Donald Trump. So, your goal is to try to get as many women as you can. Um, but she is also a minority woman, which speaks to the base of the Democratic Party. I think 93% of minority women, African American women, voted for Hillary Clinton in 2016. That was down from almost 97% who voted for the re-election of Barack Obama in 2012. So just imagine if Hillary had just had a few more percentage points, considering 77,000 votes decided that election. So your vice presidential nominee, I'll be honest, not usually a game changer. The whole argument you always say when you're choosing someone is do no harm. In the case of Dan Quayle, unfortunately, George H.W. Bush did some harm. Now we have to look at how the president and vice president of the United States are elected. And the way that we elect our president is through a process we call the Electoral College. Now, prior to an election, state legislators will meet and they will appoint two slates of electors. More if there are third or fourth parties, but usually they just appoint a Democratic and a Republican slate of electors. And those electors they correspond to the number of electoral votes a state gets. So the smallest number of electoral votes a state can get are 3 electoral votes. And currently the largest amount of electoral votes is the state of California with 55 electoral votes. So they would appoint 55 Democratic electors and 55 Republican electors in California, whereas in Delaware they would choose 3 Democratic electors and 3 Republican electors. Now, the way you determine which electors go to the Electoral College is through a direct election in the state. Most people think when we go to the polls here in November, you're electing the President of the United States, and you are not. You are not voting for Donald Trump or you are not voting for Joe Biden. You are voting for a slate of electors to then go to the Electoral College and vote for either Donald J. Trump or Joe Biden. So once these electors are chosen, so the state of California will most likely go Democratic, that will be 55 electoral votes will go to Joe Biden. Most likely Texas has 38 electoral votes. They will go to Donald Trump, most likely, so they will go to Washington and vote for Trump. So these electors will then go to the Electoral College. Under the previous Constitution, they chose their top 2 candidates, and the person who got the most votes was president. The person who got the second most votes was vice president. Today, they have 2 candidates. They vote for president and they vote for vice president, and they're technically on separate tickets. So there will be, in the Electoral College that day, there will be 2 elections for president and vice president. As I said, the previous way this worked is that the person with the most votes would become president. The person with the second most votes became vice president. But that was done away with by the 12th Amendment. Whoever gets a majority, and it has to be a majority, meaning there is no other combination of electoral votes that could equal more than the winner. And at this time, that is 270 electoral votes. That person will be deemed President of the United States. If no one gets the required 270 electoral votes, it's declared a tie in the Electoral College, and the legislative branch of the United States would choose the president and vice president. They disqualify all but the top 2 candidates, and then by a simple majority, 26 votes, the House would choose the president and the Senate would choose the vice president. Each state gets 1 vote. So it's not like in the Senate there's 100 senators and they have to get 51. Each state would get 1 vote. It's 26. The Senate chooses the vice president because he is the president of the Senate. Same rules apply. 26. Now, at the beginning of the American democracy, the term limit was 4 years renewable. Today, we do limit that 1 renewable election. So When you win the presidency, you win 4 years, and you're allowed to run to renew for a second 4 years or run for re-election. After 8 years, you cannot serve as president anymore. Now, within the White House is a organization called the Executive Office of the President of the United States. And this is essentially the people who run the day-to-day administrative duties of the presidency. Right now, there's approximately 1,800 employees, and they have a federal budget of about 500 million people or dollars. And this Executive Office of the President is run by the White House Chief of Staff. And then you can see all the different people who work in these areas. You have the director of the Domestic Policy Council who runs domestic policy like health care and immigration. The director of the National Economic Council, this is the person that helps lead the White House's economic policy and help shape what the Secretary of the Treasury will do. You have a cabinet secretary. This is the cat herder for all the federal cabinet secretaries. They kind of communicate with them. The director of communications is the person who handles all the outside communications with the media. 2 people underneath of them is the press secretary, the person who actually comes out and is supposed to do the daily briefings, followed by the director of speech writing, who writes not only the president's speeches, but a lot of times the vice president's speeches, people like that. You've got things like the chief digital officer. I think that there's another one in here that's basically, director of White House information technology. They're both basically the same thing now that we do most of our technology is digital. We have the chief of staff and the spokesperson for the First Lady, who handles her office. You have the National Security Advisor, who is the head of the National Security Council, who advises the president on security risks. You have the Director of Political Affairs. This is the person who helps the president navigate through political issues. How are we going to get these votes and things like that in the House and the Senate. Director of Presidential Personnel, that's HR, essentially. The Director of Scheduling and Advance, this is the person who schedules the president's trips and sets the Secret Service up on doing the groundwork, the advance work before the president steps foot. So if he's coming to do a campaign rally weeks before, there's an advance team setting up and preparing for his visit. You have the White House Counsel, or the Counsel to the President. This is the administration's lawyer. He defends the administration, not the president, but the administration as a whole. You have the Director of Oval Office Operations. This is the person that handles the electricity, the water, making sure essentially that the White House is not just a house, but a government building, an office building. You have the Director of the White House Military Office. This particular person handles the correspondence with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, the Defense Secretary, and all the command level generals and admirals that are beneath. As I said, the president also appoints a federal cabinet, and the people in charge of these positions are what we call a secretary. Now, there's one exception to this, obviously, and that's the Department of Justice. They are not they don't call themselves secretary, they call themselves attorney general. The top 4, they're at the very top: the Secretary of State, the Department of the Treasury, the Department of Defense, and the Department of Justice. All of these are the first 4 of the major federal cabinet positions that were set up by George Washington in 1789. The Secretary of State initially had wide-ranging powers. They were the head of the foreign mission. They were the chief diplomats, but they also handled basically everything on the home front. It was like a foreign minister and a domestic minister all wrapped into one. Many of the departments that are below, like Interior and Agriculture, have eventually been spun off of the Secretary of State's position. Okay, so Secretary of State at one time was a catch-all. That's why still, even though they really don't have much to do with domestic policy today, when a president resigns, he has to send his resignation to the Secretary of State. The Secretary of State is also the keeper of what we call the Great Seal of the United States. He's the one that has to stamp legislation. The Department of the Treasury, this is essentially the person that's in charge of the economy. They are in charge of printing money and coinage. They are the chief financial officer of the United States. The Department of Defense is actually a combination of 3 cabinet positions that existed before 1947. They were the Department of War, the Department of the Army, and the Department of the Navy. These 3 departments were unified into the Department of Defense. If the Secretary of State is the chief diplomat and the Department of the Treasury, that secretary is the chief economic officer. This is the chief security officer of the United States. They are there to protect America from threats, both foreign and domestic. Finally, of the original 4 is the Department of Justice, headed by the Attorney General. This is the chief law enforcement officer of the United States. He is supposed to be, of all of these, the most independent. He is not only appointed and approved by the president, but he is also theoretically outside the realm of the president in that he can, if necessary, step in and actually, if needed, investigate a president that is misbehaving. So the Department of Justice is by far the most independent of them. The U.S. Department of the Interior was the first one that was founded after the beginning of the American democracy. This was created in March of 1849. This was spun off of the Secretary of State's position. They were essentially in charge of, well, all of America's natural resources. Around the Civil War time, you then saw the creation of the Department of Agriculture. This was designed not only to stimulate the agricultural sector of America, but also to begin helping people move west. Then you had the creation of what we called the Department of Commerce and Labor. Eventually, they will split into 2 different cabinet positions when they found out that commerce and labor it was hard to get along. The Department of Commerce is really designed to represent business interests, and Department of Labor is designed to represent the people who work in those businesses. So, the Commerce Secretary, his job is to make sure business is as happy and has common sense regulations, but nothing over, dramatic. Whereas the Department of Labor is looking out for the workers, making sure the workers are not being taken advantage of by big business. Some of the newer ones, the Department of Health and Human Services and the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Health and Human Services is designed for health care, national pandemics like we're living through right now. Department of Housing and Urban Development is designed to help make sure that low-income families have homes, and that we invest in the cities where the poorest of Americans live. The Department of Transportation, this is the catch-all for all the transportation, whether it's automobiles, trucks, trains, planes. The Department of Transportation is the one that regulates and runs policy for the transportation network in America. The Department of Energy is an interesting one. It deals with our energy resources, solar, wind, coal, oil, nuclear. And not only do they do that, they also protect our nuclear weapon capacity. The Department of Education. This is the federal body that oversees all of the education here in the United States, whether it's four-year college or university, junior college, high school, middle school, elementary school, preschool. The Department of Education has some hand in all of that. The Department of Veterans Affairs, this is designed simply to advocate and take care of our nation's war veterans. And the newest one, which was founded after the September 11th attacks, is the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. This was designed to take, you had things like the Treasury Department had the Secret Service because they were the money cops before they were the presidential protection cops. And the Coast Guard, which technically at some times was part of the Treasury, but during times of war, it was part of the Department of Defense. And it took the national intelligence agencies that were all separate branches within the cabinet, and they unified this into one cabinet level that would be able to come together and work with the Department of Defense to protect the American homeland. And I think it was founded in 2002 or 2003 was when it finally got up and operating. So these are the federal departments that make up the cabinet. One final group that we talk about are the Joint Chiefs of Staff. This is the military command of the United States. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff is the top military officer in the United States, and he is assisted by the vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Under them, as part of the Chiefs of Staff, you have the Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army, the Chief of Staff of the U.S. Air Force, you have the Chief of Naval Operations, the Chief of Space Operations, which is the newest level, and the Chief of the National Guard Bureau. Notice that the Commandant of the United States Marine Corps. Notice that the Commandant of the United States Coast Guard is not a member, and that is because it has obviously, as I said before, moved to be part of the Department of Homeland Security. It's not within the Department of Defense or the military command. Now, they also have an enlisted advisor. This is called the Senior Enlisted Advisor to the Chairman. This is the enlisted person's representative to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Here is a flow chart of how the Joint Chiefs of Staff works. You'll see at the very top that there's the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He is usually a 4-star general or an admiral. He's a 4-star rank. He is assisted by the assistant to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, a 3-star level position, and then the assistants to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff for National Guard and Reserve Matters, which is a 2-star level. These are the people who assist the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Also in this is the Senior Enlisted Advisor, but he has a less formal role in this flow chart. Below the chairman of the Joint Chiefs is the vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs, a 4-star level position as well, and then below him is each representative of the military branch. The Chief of Staff of the Army, 4 stars, the Commandant of the Marine Corps, 4 stars, the Chief of Naval Operations, 4 stars, the Chief of the Staff of the Air Force, 4 stars, and Chief of the National Guard Bureau. Now, again, remember that this flow chart was made, I think, in 2017 or 2018. We have added the Chief of Space Command, which was rolled off of the Chief of Staff of the Air Force. So there is a 6th position now. Below them is a 3-star level Director of the Joint Staff. And then below them are the different command positions, which do usually have a star rank to them. Now the question is, who was our greatest president? Well, it just really depends on the day and the time and who's asking the question. Now, when you ask the average Americans, through things like the Gallup's poll, usually have Abraham Lincoln as number one. He is universally considered to be number one by most. Currently, the Gallup poll rankings show Ronald Reagan at 2 and John F. Kennedy at 3. Bill Clinton's 4. FDR is 5. Washington 6. Truman 7. George W. Bush is 8. Theodore Roosevelt's 9. Eisenhower's 10. Thomas Jefferson's 11. And Jimmy Carter's 12. Now, this is done simply by asking the American people who they feel is the best president. Now, obviously, that's not scientific. That's just asking people feelings. We also do what's called the historians' rankings or ratings. And this is more scientific in that historians look at basically a bunch of different criteria to decide where they rank American presidents. And so, for example, let's look at this list and see where there's differences. Abraham Lincoln is obviously going to be number one. Abraham Lincoln saved the Union. He won the American Civil War, kept the country together. So obviously he's number one. Now, number two is Franklin Roosevelt. Now, why would historians consider him to be number two? Well, he not only saved the American economy, but then he saved not only the U.S., but the world when it comes to democracy by leading America through World War II. George Washington's obviously number 3. We give him credit for, the fact that, you don't look at that he was the general that won the war. You don't look at any of that. But you look at the fact that he created the entire federal government from scratch, that he set the precedent for what a president would be. Theodore Roosevelt, number 4. People don't give Theodore Roosevelt enough credit. Theodore Roosevelt brought power and prestige back to the presidency, which had been lacking since the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. He also, which people don't realize, was a conservative, but was willing to give lots of liberal progressive reforms to save the country from a socialist style collapse like happened in Russia a decade later. Harry Truman was seen as honest and capable, so most historians rank him as 5. Wilson has taken a slide due to some of his racist policies, but again, remember that historians, we put people in context of their time. Wilson was considered one of the big progressive presidents, and there were lots of legislative victories for Wilson, whether you like them or not. Jefferson is considered one of our top presidents by historians, and that's mainly because of the Louisiana Purchase, that he successfully did a peaceful transfer of power from one party to another, and he really was, other than Washington, he was the key figure in what we call the early Republic period. Now, you notice John F. Kennedy's 8 on our list versus what I call the beauty pageant or Gallup poll ratings. Well, most historians look at John F. Kennedy and they say, well, he had the potential to be a great president, and he did some good things, but it was cut short too quickly. So we rate him on not only what he did, but where he was going with that. But we don't give a lot of credence to that. We just basically say, he had momentum. He was going to do well. Now look at number 9, Dwight D. Eisenhower. Now, why is Eisenhower so popular amongst historians? Well, it's not because he was the general during World War II. It's because during his presidency was what we made up of the 1950s. We had a great economy. Although it's funny, he's a Republican, and taxes were about 73% at that time, the highest they've ever been in American history. But those taxes that he collected created the national highway system. He created the suburbs. Really, the beginning of what we call the white flight into the suburbs in the late 1940s, early 1950s. The U.S. economy boomed during the 50s. You had the population boom in the 50s. This is really the decade of the baby boomers. The baby boomers started right after World War II, but the decade after that, the 1950s, saw the U.S. population just explode. With the national highway system, you saw motels start springing up, gas stations. The 1950s is a very dynamic time in American history. And so he is remembered quite fondly by historians. Number 10 is Lyndon B. Johnson. Johnson's on this list, quite honestly, because of the Civil Rights era, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, also his Great Society plan to end hunger and poverty. Number 11 is Ronald Reagan. And some of you might look at this and say, well, how can Gallup poll have him as number 2, but historians have him as number 11? Well, again, this is about personal feelings when it comes to Gallup poll. They ask the question, who do you think was the best president? We're not looking at that as historians. We're looking at, and political scientists. I keep referring to myself as a historian because that is my primary field. I am primarily a historian. Ronald Reagan did a lot of good things. But in comparison to some of the others on the list, there were some lacking areas. People will give him credit for the Cold War ending, but actually it was the policies of Truman, Eisenhower, and Kennedy that really brought about the collapse of the Soviet Union. It was only a matter of if or when it was going to collapse, not if, and Reagan was just lucky enough to be there when it happened. Not to say he didn't help spend them out of business, but they were already doing that. Reagan was seen as a transitional figure. Realistically, he was the last of the major presidents that was, born before 1920. He was the last of that pre-World War I era group to serve as president. He was also really the architect of what we call the modern conservative movement. So he is remembered for historical reasons at the top of the list, but just not as high as some of the people who are asking their feelings on him. Finally, James K. Polk. Now, that's one that's not on the other list, and you're like, wow, where did James K. Polk come from? Well, James K. Polk was elected in 1844. He ran on a 5-point platform, and he said that if he got all 5 things done, he would retire after 4 years. And James K. Polk got all 5 things done, and after 4 years, he stepped down as president. Considered to be, by the way, historians would say he is the only really successful one-term president we've ever had. He is also highly underrated when you compare them to other people. And a lot of times, if you look at the other guys on the list, except for maybe Jimmy Carter, most of the guys on this list had 2 terms. The popular ones had 2 terms. Historians don't necessarily look at the number of terms. They look at the achievements involved. So this is how we decide, or this is how historians versus the public decide who are the more popular presidents. Now, obviously, this was done in 2007 and 2000. No, I'm sorry. It looks like the Gallup poll was done in 2007, and it looks like these historians' rankings that the book provided were 2000. Now, obviously, that has changed. I just used the book's one because it's the one you can follow in the textbook while you're reading.